Bradley Thorne called me into his office exactly 2 weeks after I buried Gerald Vance. I already knew what was coming. In our line of work, you do not get a calendar invite from the vice president with no subject line unless someone is about to get screwed. I walked in, closed the heavy door behind me, and took the leather chair across from him without waiting for an invitation. Bradley looked like he was trying exceptionally hard to play the part of a seasoned commander. He was leaning back in his executive chair, spinning a gold pen, acting as though he had won, not preparing to betray me. He adjusted his cuffs, cleared his throat, and told me that my role as senior operations manager was being phased out due to organizational restructuring. Just like that. There was no performance review, no prior warning, and no transition plan. It was a cold, calculated move designed to catch me off guard. I did not blink or shift in my chair. I simply nodded, refusing to show any weakness. Bradley leaned forward, his expensive gold ring scratching the polished wood of his desk, and slid a thin folder toward me. He told me that before I packed my belongings, they would need a full, detailed client transfer for every account Gerald Vance had managed, especially the West Coast portfolio. Hearing those words, I had to suppress a smile. The executives at this firm had absolutely no idea what Gerald Vance and I had done before his passing. They were completely in the dark, believing they were in control of the board. I picked up the folder, flipped through the pages, stood up and dropped it back onto his desk. I told him that I would cooperate with legal, but warned him that if I were in his position, I would not count on retaining those West Coast clients. Bradley frowned, asking what that was supposed to mean, but I turned and walked out the door, letting him stew in his own confusion. The roots of this confrontation had been planted 8 months earlier. It was a rainy Tuesday evening when Gerald Vance called me into his office after hours. The entire floor was dead quiet, leaving only the soft glow of his desk lamp. He was holding a cup of black coffee in one hand, staring out the window at the city skyline with a serious, distant look that he only wore when something of critical importance was on his mind. He did not ask me to sit down. He kept his back to me for a long moment before speaking, telling me that he had been watching me run circles around the other managers for 12 years. I shrugged, saying it was not particularly difficult given the competition. Gerald Vance turned to face me, his face pale and lined with fatigue. He told me that the board would never promote me, no matter how hard I worked, because I did not fit their social club. I asked him what club he was referring to, and he simply smiled a tired, knowing smile. Then, he delivered the blow that changed everything. He told me he had been diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer, and the doctors had given him perhaps 9 months to live. He spoke with no self-pity or emotion, stating the facts as if he were reading a balance sheet. Then he looked me dead in the eye and said he wanted me to have his entire client book. I started to protest, but his voice cut through me, sharp and commanding. He told me he was not asking for my permission, but insisted that the transfer had to remain completely confidential. We both knew the corporate structure too well. If the board or the vice president caught wind of his plans, they would immediately intervene, replace Gerald Vance with one of their loyal sycophants, and carve up the accounts before he was even gone. So, under the radar, we began preparing our move. Every week, after normal business hours or during the quiet hours of the weekend, Gerald Vance and I met with his primary clients. Most of them were mid-sized West Coast companies, stable construction suppliers, tech infrastructure vendors, and major regional trucking operations. These were solid, cash-flowing businesses that had been loyal to Gerald Vance for decades. He introduced me to each of them as his primary operations director, explaining that I was streamlining their systems and preparing the groundwork for long-term succession. To anyone watching from the corporate office, it looked like standard training and shadowing. Nothing we did triggered any red flags or security alerts in the internal system. Sometimes we flew out to California to meet them in person, traveling in cheap rental cars, while Gerald Vance coughed heavily but insisted on driving himself. He would joke that the clients needed to see he was still behind the wheel, even if his engine was running out of fuel. At every single meeting, Gerald Vance deliberately shifted more responsibility onto my shoulders, letting me answer the tough questions and make the critical operational decisions. The clients were sharp business owners, and they quickly realized what was happening, but they did not object. Gerald Vance had earned their absolute trust over 30 years of service. If he said I was the professional they could rely on, they accepted it without question. During a quiet dinner in Sacramento, I asked him why he was risking so much to hand this portfolio to me. He stared into his glass and told me it was because I did not flatter the executives, and I did not flinch when things got difficult. That was the moment I realized this was not just a career opportunity. It was a silent, legal counterstrike against a corrupt corporate machine. To ensure the transition was entirely legal and enforceable, Gerald Vance and I brought in his longtime personal attorney, Clara Jenkins, 4 months before he went away. Clara was a sharp, no-nonsense lawyer who specialized in contract law and asset protection. She was the one who designed the entire framework to make sure the transfers were completely airtight and left no paper trail for the firm to exploit. During our first late-night meeting in her office, I raised the issue of non-compete agreements. I knew the firm routinely forced employees to sign restrictive covenants, and I was concerned they would use them to choke my independent operations. Clara merely smiled, adjusted her glasses, and explained that under California law, specifically California Business and Professions Code Section 16,600, every contract that restrains anyone from engaging in a lawful profession, trade, or business is void and unenforceable. Since our clients were based on the West Coast and my operations would be headquartered in California, the firm had no legal grounds to prevent me from working with them. She assured us that as long as we did not use proprietary corporate trade secrets, I was completely clean. Gerald Vance nodded in agreement, his breathing shallow but his mind as sharp as ever. Over the next several weeks, Clara meticulously prepared the assignment agreements for each account. Gerald Vance signed the portfolio transfer documents, client by client, and each agreement was properly notarized, recorded, and witnessed. The transfer of the $96 million portfolio was completed quietly, 3 weeks before Gerald Vance closed his eyes for the last time. When Clara packed up the final notarized documents, she looked at me and confirmed that the clients belonged to me legally. Back in the present, I walked out of Bradley Thorne's office and went straight to my desk. I pulled 2 folders from my drawer. The first was a blue folder containing a list of Gerald Vance's accounts, but it was carefully clipped. It listed his secondary regional clients, but completely excluded the West Coast accounts. The second folder was a red one, containing my formal resignation letter, signed and dated, effective immediately. I walked back to the executive suite, bypassed the assistant, and walked straight into Bradley's office. He looked up, startled, as I dropped both folders on his desk. He reached for the blue folder first, opening it eagerly, as if he were about to claim his prize. I watched his face tighten as he scanned the pages. His eyes darted down the list, and his lips pressed into a thin line. He looked up, his expression dark, and asked where the West Coast accounts were. I shrugged, telling him that I was not privy to those files, and that Gerald Vance had handled them personally. It was a calculated lie, but he had no way of proving otherwise. Bradley set the folder down slowly, trying to maintain his composure, and told me that this was not going to work. That was when I pointed to the red folder. He opened it, read the resignation letter, and blinked in disbelief. He stood up, his voice rising, and asked if I was walking away from my career. He shouted that I did not own those accounts, that they belonged to the firm because Gerald Vance was an employee. I kept my voice level and told him that legally he was incorrect, but he was welcome to verify that fact with his legal team. I turned and walked out, ignoring his shouting. The firm's reaction was immediate and chaotic. Over the next 48 hours, my phone was flooded with calls and emails from corporate lawyers and HR executives. One junior attorney even cornered me in the parking lot as I was loading the last of my personal belongings into my car, demanding to know if Gerald Vance had signed a formal transition protocol. I gave them absolutely nothing, climbing into my car and driving away without a word. Meanwhile, I spent my evenings making private, personal phone calls to each of the West Coast clients. I explained that I was no longer with the firm, but that I was establishing my own independent agency and had the full structural history Gerald Vance had left behind. Not a single client hesitated. They had worked with me for months, and they knew I was the one who actually managed their logistics and supply chains. Within 4 days of my resignation, I had signed the first 5 consulting agreements under my new firm's name. The firm's executives believed they could intimidate me into compliance, but they did not realize I had already moved the entire board. They were left holding an empty folder, while the actual value of the $96 million portfolio had already walked out the door with me. To reassure the clients during this transition, I sent each of them a copy of the notarized agreements Clara Jenkins had drafted, proving the transfer was fully authorized by Gerald Vance. Furthermore, Clara Jenkins established a secure online portal for client data. This operational transparency made the clients feel comfortable, as they could see their records were protected. I spent that first weekend setting up my home office, converting my guest bedroom into a temporary command center. The desks were covered with laptops, hard drives, and printed client spreadsheets. My 12 years of experience at the firm had taught me exactly how to manage complex operations, and I was determined to show the clients that they would not experience a single day of disruption. I confirmed with a major shipping vendor in California that our supply lines remained active. He laughed when I told him I had resigned, saying he had always preferred dealing with me because the executives at the old firm were too busy to answer their phones. This positive feedback gave me the confidence I needed to push forward, knowing that the structural foundation of our business was unbreakable. The first formal threat from the firm's corporate legal department arrived in my inbox 2 days later. The letter was signed by a senior partner at their prestigious corporate law firm, and it contained a bold line warning me that I was in unauthorized possession of company assets. They were attempting to use heavy-handed intimidation tactics, hoping I would panic and return the West Coast clients. They alleged that I had downloaded proprietary database records and violated trade secret protections. I did not respond. Instead, I forwarded the email to Clara Jenkins. 10 minutes later, Clara called me, laughing softly. She told me the firm was acting out of desperation and that their legal claims were incredibly sloppy. Under California law, a client list is not considered a proprietary trade secret if the clients choose to move their business voluntarily. She instructed me to keep forwarding every piece of communication and to remain completely silent. The firm soon realized their initial threats were not working, so they shifted to a softer approach. An executive from the Human Resources Department left a long voicemail, offering me a substantial transition bonus if I agreed to return to the firm and assist with a smooth handoff. The next day, Bradley Thorne emailed me directly, proposing a temporary consulting retainer to help settle the accounts. He wrote a lengthy message, claiming that we could still maintain a professional relationship and that my departure did not have to be adversarial. He suggested that we could split the commissions on the West Coast book for a transition period. I ignored both offers, refusing to engage with his desperate attempts. When they received no response, they sent a formal package via courier to my home. Inside was a contract offering a $600,000 annual retainer, combined with a $300,000 sign-on bonus, totaling a $900,000 package just to transition the clients. This was a massive sum, clearly intended to make me hesitate and reconsider my position. I drove to Clara's office and slid the contract across her desk. She scanned the terms, looked up at me, and asked if I wanted her to shred it. I nodded, telling her I had no intention of selling out the legacy Gerald Vance had built. I wanted to build my own business on honesty, not take their hush money. When the firm realized I could not be bought or intimidated, they decided to play dirty. I received a phone call from one of my primary clients in Reno, the chief executive of High Desert Logistics, a major regional supplier named Jeffrey. He sounded furious. He demanded to know why my former employer was calling his team, offering a 40% discount to undercut my rates, and claiming that I was unstable and had abandoned the company in the middle of a critical transition. I felt my jaw tighten, but I kept my voice calm. I asked him to email me any written proposals or documentation they had sent. They had gone full smear, contacting clients directly and falsely claiming that I had violated confidentiality agreements. Fortunately, Those confidentiality clauses did not exist in my original employment contract. Clara Jenkins and I immediately went to work. We drafted formal responses to each client, enclosing copies of the signed assignment agreements and Gerald Vance's written instructions. Every single client had consented to the transfer in writing, meaning there was no breach of contract or theft of assets. Clara Jenkins finalized and mailed cease and desist letters to the firm's corporate headquarters within 72 hours, warning them that their actions constituted tortious interference with business relations. Despite our legal warnings, the firm's executives refused to back down. 2 days later, the founder of a promising startup client in San Diego called me in a panic. The startup, named Apex Dynamics, relied heavily on our operational support for their distribution channels. The founder, a young entrepreneur named Adrian, explained that a representative from the firm's legal team had threatened his board, claiming the startup would be held legally liable for engaging my services. They had falsely asserted that I was in breach of my employment contract and that the startup was complicit in the theft of trade secrets. The firm even offered to buy Apex Dynamics out of their contract with me, promising them a cleaner transition and cheaper operational support if they returned to the old firm. Adrian was terrified of a costly legal battle that could ruin his young company and scare away his primary venture capital investors. I told Adrian to remain calm and assured him that the firm was merely bluffing, but I knew I had to act quickly to protect my business and my clients. I hung up the phone, took a deep breath, and opened the private file Gerald Vance had given me before his death. It was time to use the leverage he had spent years accumulating. I wanted to show Bradley Thorne that his empty corporate threats would have real, devastating consequences for his own standing in the financial industry. I refused to let them bully my clients or tarnish the reputation I had worked so hard to build over 12 years of service. I spent that evening reviewing Gerald Vance's personal folders, examining the detailed records of corporate alliances and favors. I knew that the firm's leadership relied heavily on external capital to maintain their market dominance, and if I could disrupt those financial connections, their entire legal campaign would collapse. I prepared a summary of our client agreements to send to Adrian's board, showing that we were in full compliance with the law. This gave them the confidence to stand firm, but I knew the real battle would be fought behind closed doors, using the leverage Gerald Vance had carefully preserved. I scanned Gerald Vance's private contact list, looking for a specific name that he had underlined twice in red ink. The name was Walter Briggs, a managing partner at Summit Holdings, a powerful private equity firm. Beside his name, Gerald Vance had written a brief note, owed 2 favors, series, a funding. The history behind this note was significant. Years ago, Gerald Vance had saved Walter's early investment fund during the financial downturn of 2008 by restructuring their debt. Later, Gerald Vance had introduced Walter to the founders of a massive shipping conglomerate. I did not hesitate. I dialed the private number and introduced myself as Oliver Mercer, the manager Gerald Vance had mentored. Walter answered immediately, his voice warm. He told me he had been expecting my call and expressed his deep condolences for Gerald Vance's passing. I explained the situation, detailing how the firm was using intimidation tactics and threatening to sue my startup client, Apex Dynamics in San Diego, to force them to break their contract with me. Walter listened in silence, his tone shifting from warm remembrance to cold professional focus. He asked if the firm had actually put these threats in writing to the startup's board. I confirmed that they had sent formal letters alleging trade secret theft. Walter sighed and told me that Gerald Vance had been a man of his word and that he would honor his debt. He said that Bradley Thorne was an arrogant fool who did not understand how real business was conducted. He told me to give him 24 hours to handle the matter. The next afternoon, Adrian called me back from San Diego. His voice was shaking with excitement. He asked me what I had done, explaining that Apex Dynamics' primary venture capital investors, who were closely allied with Walter Briggs, had suddenly pulled their corporate funds out of my old firm. They had backed Apex Dynamics instead, doubling their Series A funding to $20 million. The firm's intimidation tactics had backfired completely, costing them their relationship with a major private equity group and leaving Bradley Thorne to explain the sudden loss of capital to his board of directors. This was a massive blow to the firm's credibility, and it sent a clear message to the industry that we were a formidable force in the market. With the San Diego client secured, I began calling the other names on Gerald Vance's private list. I contacted a hosting vendor in Seattle, run by a woman named Diana, who immediately agreed to waive 8 months of infrastructure fees for my new clients. I reached out to a marketing firm in Phoenix, run by a manager named Jared, and his team designed a complete rebrand for my agency for a fraction of the standard cost. A powerful corporate contact in Los Angeles began recommending my new agency during board meetings, landing us 3 new pitches in a single week. We were building a powerful independent network, fueled by the loyalty and respect Gerald Vance had earned over his 30 years of service. As my business grew, the old firm became increasingly desperate. One morning, I walked out of my building and saw a young man in a cheap suit standing near the steps, holding a tablet. He was fumbling with his words, claiming to represent a financial support group. But he looked terrified. I realized the firm was sending low-level interns to stand outside my office and attempt to intercept my clients. I confronted him, asking if Bradley Thorne had sent him to do his dirty work. The intern turned bright red, mumbled an excuse, and walked away quickly. It was a pathetic display of corporate desperation that showed how quickly they were losing their grip. Rather than engaging in their petty corporate warfare, I focused on building my new business. I leased a spacious, modern office near the harbor. The space was bright and open, with long tables and fresh paint, designed for real collaboration. My team began to expand, and we focused on delivering honest, transparent results. Our reputation spread quickly by word of mouth. One trucking company introduced us to their logistics partners, who then recommended us to regional suppliers. Within 2 months of opening our new space, we had doubled our client base. One evening, I received a message on LinkedIn from Gordon, a mid-level manager at my old firm. He was a capable professional who had always stayed out of the corporate politics. He wrote that he had watched the way the firm treated people, and he wanted to join my new agency, even if it meant taking a junior role with less pay. I called him and made my expectations clear. I told him that I did not require blind loyalty, but I did need someone who cared about the work and treated clients with respect. Gordon accepted the terms immediately, and I made a note to send him his onboarding documents the following Monday. My agency was growing, and we were building it on the foundation of integrity that Gerald Vance had always championed. We wanted to establish a business where trust was the primary currency, proving to the entire industry that corporate politics and greed were not the only ways to succeed in this highly competitive market. Gordon was a valuable addition to our team, as he had extensive knowledge of the internal processes and could help us streamline our administrative tasks. His decision to join us was a testament to the changing tide, showing that even within the old firm, there were professionals who were tired of the corruption and wanted to work in an honest environment. We spent the week in integrating him into our daily client briefings. The atmosphere in our harbor office was completely different from the toxic corporate environment we had left behind. There were no hidden agendas or political games, just dedicated professionals working together to deliver exceptional service. A few weeks after we settled into the harbor office, I received a letter in the mail. The envelope had no return address, but I recognized the postmark from the town where Gerald Vance's sister, Sarah Vance, lived. Inside was a short note from Sarah Vance, explaining that Gerald Vance had instructed her to mail this package to me only when the old firm began to play dirty. Along with the note was a small silver key. I remembered Gerald Vance's instructions and went to the framed photograph of Big Sir that hung in the office lobby. I pulled the frame down and found a small lockbox key taped to the back of the wood. That night, after the office had emptied, I unlocked the metal box Gerald Vance had given me before his passing. Inside lay a manila folder filled with financial documents, audit logs, and internal emails that had never been shared with the board. It contained detailed evidence of systemic securities fraud and embezzlement. For over 4 years, Bradley Thorne and another senior executive named Owen had been siphoning funds from the firm, stealing a total of $7,400,000. They had utilized fake consulting agreements with shell companies, such as Vanguard Partners and Apex Logistics Solutions, which were nothing more than post office boxes. They had also altered quarterly revenue reports to justify massive inflated bonuses for themselves, and had even backdated contracts with forged signatures, which violated California Penal Code Section 470, rendering those agreements void ab initio. Gerald Vance had documented everything, keeping the records in case the executives ever tried to destroy his team. The documents were incredibly detailed, showing bank transaction records, tracking numbers, and specific IP addresses used to approve the fraudulent vendor payments. There were personal emails from Bradley Thorne to Owen, explicitly discussing how to hide the losses from the external auditors by shifting deferred assets into the current quarter. Gerald Vance had even highlighted the specific entries in the general ledger that had been manipulated, leaving a clear roadmap for any investigator. It was a masterpiece of forensic accounting, gathered silently over years of observation. I realized that Gerald Vance had known about this corruption for a long time, but had waited to act until he had undeniable proof that could protect his team from retaliation. This folder was the ultimate weapon, a shield that would end their corporate careers once and for all. I immediately drove to Clara Jenkins' office and showed her the files. She scanned the documents, her face growing serious, and told me that this was the final blow. She immediately contacted investigator Devin Cole from the State Financial Crimes Unit. Devin Cole was a quiet, clean-cut investigator in his early 40s who did not smile or waste time. We met in Clara's conference room, and I dropped the folder on the table, explaining that Gerald Vance had instructed me to deliver these files if the firm attempted to destroy my business. Devin Cole reviewed the bank records, the shell company transactions, and the altered reports, taking notes and photographing several key email chains. He looked up at me and asked why I had waited until now to bring this forward. I looked him in the eye and told him that until now it was a business dispute, but now it was a matter of survival. Devin Cole nodded, slid the folder into an evidence sleeve, and assured me that his office would launch a formal investigation immediately. He explained that this level of evidence was rare and that they would move quickly to secure the corporate servers before the executives could destroy the digital backups. He noted that their forensic team would verify every IP address and bank routing number over the coming weekend. This detailed verification would ensure that the evidence was completely unassailable in court. The fallout was swift and devastating. 3 weeks after my meeting with Devin Cole, the State Financial Crimes Unit executed a search warrant at the firm's corporate headquarters, seizing computers and filing cabinets. The local news ran a major headline detailing a massive securities fraud investigation targeting the prominent investment firm. Within 48 hours, Bradley Thorne and Owen were suspended pending the outcome of the criminal investigation. The firm's stock price took a nosedive, and their primary investors began pulling their funds. 4 weeks after the raid, the firm's assets were liquidated, and the company was officially shut down. The corrupt executives were facing federal charges of securities fraud and wire fraud under Title 18 of the United States Code, ensuring they would spend years in a federal penitentiary. I did not celebrate or gloat. I simply went to work. In the lobby of my harbor office, I hung the framed photo of Gerald Vance, and underneath it, I placed a small brass plaque that read, "Integrity is a legacy." I looked at his smiling face, gave a quiet nod, and walked back to my desk to start the day. The corporate machine had tried to crush us, but we had stood our ground and built something that would last. We had vindicated Gerald Vance's memory and proved that a business built on honesty could triumph over the most corrupt executives, establishing a new standard for everyone who followed in our footsteps. I was finally at peace, knowing that his life's work was safe and that we had built a company we were proud to call our own.